Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for webinar 3, and we'll be discussing environmental review records. With this presentation, to join us today, we have myself, Rebecca Shademan, Steve Charleston, and Aaron Boucher, and Amber Ward. We'll be moderating the Q&A for any questions you may have, and also taking a look at websites or handouts that we provided to you earlier in the week. And we'll go ahead and get started. And Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. And I see there are persons adding on as the numbers roll up to 43, including staff members and friends out there that are probably new to CDBG and environmental review. So this session should go 3 hours, if at all possible. And then you're welcome to following if you come across questions, situations where you would need an answer, a clarification. Please do contact us, myself, Aaron, and Tom Stevens. Tom's not on the call. He's on leave, vacation, catching salmon somewhere in the northwest part of the country. So out in the hinterlands. So we'll get started on the environmental review. This is an extremely important part of the cross-cutting items, and this one especially is attached to the CDBG program. And if CDBG touches in terms of funds into other funding sources, and some funding sources are not the same as the environmental review process for HUD, but we need to follow that one in collaboration with those other funding sources. So we'll move on and give you an overview of the topics that we're going to cover today. And as mentioned, some of you may not know who I am, Steve Charleston. I'm the CDBG program manager for the allocation, and I also assist with the CARES Act COVID-19 in terms of CDBG CV. We do also have another major program that's CDBG DER, disaster recovery. So if you work on the CV side, the DER side, you will also need to understand environmental review. So we're going to talk about a summary, give you a summary of the review process, project description, which is extremely important in terms of identifying that project for the public to know. The determination of level of review, which we call, and there's a number of acronyms. This is a DLR, determination of level of review. And this is the platform that you step off of and move to one of 4 levels of entertainment. There's an 8-step process, which may be engaged depending upon whether you're working with a project that is significant enough touching and involved in the wetlands and also floodplains. There's tiered reviews, which go into looking at specific project sites, addresses. That applies generally with commercial rehab and also with owner-occupied rehab. There's a statutory checklist that several of the review processes will need to go. There's 14 individual regulatory pieces that need to be reviewed. And then there's another item that deals with 3 others, what we call the other, which is 58.6 in terms of numerically numbering. We'll talk about timing. Timing is extremely important in terms of notifications, publications, but also walking through the process in terms of when actions take place from the determination of the level of review to the actual completion of the environmental review. Useful websites, we'll only explain and present those that are useful. And those are items that usually Rebecca goes into. So that's her ability to access those and to share those with you. And then we'll talk about key item, which is source documentation. And through all this, just remember, as we've talked before, that it all ties in to documentation and record keeping. And when we get to monitoring, it's also a key component of that. So let's move on to an intro. There's a Housing Community Development Act. There's a Housing Act of 1949, which I don't recall even the passage of that in person. As we talked earlier, decent, safe, and sanitary home and suitable living environment for every American. I don't think that mission has been met, but that's what we're moving towards. There's the HUD environmental policy. This is the policy of the department. It says reject proposals which have significant adverse environmental impacts and to encourage modifications. But it's also the fact that it accepts. So we do accept those environmental reviews that are not significant or do not have adverse environmental impacts. And we also are looking at those modifications or mitigations to minimize environmental harm, which we address in the environmental review process. There's NEPA and implementation regulations and HUD's regulatory process. We'll talk about what NEPA is next. Okay, if you look at NEPA, you would think that would be the National Environmental Protection Act. Well, it's the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969. And it's been amended over time, and there's also some processes going in place now with the current administration to reverse some items that have taken place from the prior administration. So it's always an item in terms of environmental review that has flex to it. It's our charter for protection of the environment. They did establish a Council of Environmental Quality. It does require federal agencies to implement and in their own regulations, which HUD does have those. It establishes environmental values, what's appropriate in terms of decision making, whether you're moving from a exempt activity for planning to, and we don't get into impact statements, but if you're doing one that is significant, but when we do move into an assessment of a project based upon looking at the regulatory components and the source documentation. It ensures environmental information is available to the public, and that's a key part of it to make sure that it is a public record and it's done before we make decisions and move on to, for example, as we discussed, it's one of the special conditions environmental review is under the subrecipients agreement. And prior to issuing a release of funds, the agency for the program has a requirement to clear the environmental review, that record that is submitted by the subrecipient. So you would see in your letter, there's a release of funds and an environmental clearance. So the environmental clearance can take place prior to, but we'll talk about that in special conditions that are available mainly in some projects that have involved economic development. And we want to make sure that public officials understand the decisions they're making and the consequences, because as we go forward, we'll explain the responsibility as what we call the responsible entity as far as the local elected official that signs on the line. Let's move into our flow chart, summary of the review process. This chart is posted on my wall next to me on a flipper file, and I use this chart to review the steps that each of those processes are engaged in, whether you move from exempt to category exclusion, not subject to, to category exclusion subjects or to environmental assessment. And we'll talk about in the beginning through this process about project aggregation. In other words, there are those projects which have other influences that may not be the activity that they're doing directly, but depend upon what's surrounding them and what makes a difference on impacting that activity. And those 4 items are triggered by a DLR, the determination of level of review. So I would recommend, if you have not, that this is an item you keep handy to understand the process overall, and also that when we talk about timing, that you understand the timing worksheet as we move through. So use this flow chart in terms of the overall process for environmental review. Any questions as we move forward yet?
No questions yet, Steve, but I did want to let all the attendees know we include a copy of that chart in Chapter 6, page 2, and it's also included in your handout, so that is readily available for all of you to print out and have hanging up in your offices.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. And for those of you that don't recognize me, this is me. So I am in my office today. Last year, mainly remote, but now back into the office. We want to talk about the situations when we get into evaluating an environmental review. And one of those helpful items is a site map. So depending upon where the project is, we look at the land that's developed. We look at what's happening outside that may have an influence. And we also look at what's inside and outside in terms of developed land. So there's situations that play a different role as we go through that. So as we move to the environmental review process, go ahead. So we're going to talk about the responsibilities in terms of environmental review, project aggregation, the DLR, there is an environmental review packet for completion, publication and posting, completion of the certification affidavit, when that event takes place as far as a 15-day objection period. There is a couple of periods of comment, and then there's an objection period depending upon the level of review that project moves through. And then there's how we obtain environmental clearance. And then responsibilities. The local governments are the entities eligible to receive funds, as we know. With CDBG, they're the only direct eligible applicant, and that eligible local unit of government would be awarded as a subrecipient an agreement to perform. And as mentioned, one of those special conditions in the agreement is environmental review to complete that. The local government does assume a responsibility. They call that the RE in terms of an acronym. That's your responsible entity. And in most cases, that is your village board chair, the mayor of the city, the chairperson at the county level, and in some cases, it may be at certain cases where you have an actual manager form of government that the manager is. The chief elected official assumes the role of environmental certification officer and accepts full responsibility, which means they sign off. And what they sign off on has an adherence where if the worst case scenario, they may have to actually submit themselves to the court situation depending upon, but we haven't had that case happen yet. So the chief elected official signs all certifications and all findings and dating of those certifications. Next. So here's the review process. As we mentioned, it's in our manual. And Rebecca, I don't have the manual in front of me, but it is chapter 6. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's Chapter 6, page 2.
Okay, so that notification is correct. So I want to make sure that you understand there is an updated chapter 6 in the manual, and that you'll be able to use that as you go through and complete the evaluation at the end of the webinar series. So we're going to discuss through this webinar, training event, all of these items as we move through from aggregation and beginning with determination level review. So let's move on. So we're going to talk about project aggregation, which is on the next screen. So we get into project aggregation, and what I would recommend you do is, even though we're talking a couple screens or a couple slides down about project description, will help you build your project description. So you want to identify all the funding sources for that project that's involved. You want to determine all activities involved, any other activities near the site that are closely related to the project. And when looking at the reasonable, foreseeable activities that may take place. So CDBG may be funding a specific activity in a project, but the activity or the project, I would say the project is larger in scale than what CDBG is directly funding. So this is when we get into looking at the overall project aggregation and description. So go to the next. So you want to review all activities that have an influence, whether they're specifically on the project site or outside the project site. So if the project is a community center or streets or water lines, wells, whatever those may be, you want to look at all of those items that have an influence on the development of that project. So it's how the surrounding environment affects the project. And then it's also how the project is affected by the site it's on and how the project has an influence on the surrounding environment. It makes a difference. So you have to look at that envelope larger than the project site as you move through it. So all activities may be reviewed next. So you may have a project, for example, where it's being developed, say a business on an undeveloped parcel. Our part of that project is actually the fact that we're investing in the business to locate and build a building on that site. But what difference does that make in terms of the streets, the roads, the water system, water line, and the neighbors in that area? So you have to take into consideration not only the project itself on the site, in terms of maybe that site is or is not contaminated. There was a phase 1 done where there's an evaluation, and we'll talk later about Sanborn maps that deal with looking at past use of sites. So remember to keep that in mind. So you would aggregate all these activities, and maybe that would be included within your environmental review, and maybe not. It just depends upon how you look at the influence, and maybe that would also be included in your project description. Next. So if it was necessary to add water, roads, other improvements in order for that business to have access out and off of the site and to have actually water lines, because they needed water. There was no hookups. There was no sewer, no sewage treatment that was connected. So you'd have to look at how that impacted that property, and you may have a situation where your aggregation is reviewed overall. It also depends upon where that site is located. And then you would look at the number of factors statutorily that make a difference, whether that is noise, whether they're in a floodplain or not, and a number of other incidences. Next. Okay, you have it says page 5 of the administrative manual. I didn't check to make sure that was on page 5, but Rebecca's usually a good checker to find out if, okay, thanks. Project aggregation, as we mentioned, involves the project and all other activities associated with the project. And the project aggregation determination also blends into your project description. You want to make sure you attach maps, site plans, and don't omit facts that may result in the environmental review being redone, the project descriptions, the basics for the environmental review record, determination of level of review, and moving forward. And what we've found with help from staff, and Aaron Boucher is an excellent resource for review of project descriptions, looking at how they actually displayed. A key item is to remember that the project description is not your application description. So you want to look at the project description as describing the project that is awarded. So sometimes what happens is we get 2 or 3 pages that address the why we need this project, why and what the influence is. We're looking at a shorter version in terms of lines and descriptions on need. We want to know what is the project. So if you move to the next slide. So we want to understand the purpose and the need for the project. The national objective needs to be listed in the description. You need to have a geographic location of the project. So if it is site specific, put the address in, and you want to make sure that on a graphic display, a map, that address is posted on that map so that the public can identify where that project is taking place within the community or even outside the community. You'll want to identify the area of that project, in other words, what we call a footprint. So that would be in terminology of the parcel or the lot or the acreage or whatever it is where that project is to be placed and what is going to happen to that ground, the summary of the area, any numbers that you can provide when you get into a description on owner-occupied rehab. You would identify the number of dwelling units that were going to be placed. If you had an infrastructure project and you had a good idea of the length and where the sewer lines were going to be installed, maybe it's the streets that are going to be improved. You need to specifically identify those on the map. Don't just circle the community and this is where the project is. You need to actually locate those on the map. Go ahead. And a description in terms of the activities, and you're going to break this down by activities and by costs. And that's going to include CDBG is how many dollars paying for what activity and what other type of money is going into it, the amounts and the source. I mean, what is financing that? You want to make sure that they know who the applicant and the owner is, if there is, other than the local unit of government. So if it's a nonprofit that the local unit of government received an award on behalf of, we need the name. It's a public record and it needs to be available for the public review. There are some common statements that need to be in there dealing with no residence, business, or farms will be displaced, and identification of the site as such. Go ahead. Okay, any comments about questions about project description? Because I know we've turned several back over the last several months.
Steve, I just want to add that with our 2021 applications, we did require applicants to submit Exhibit R, a draft of their environmental review record. So we hopefully can streamline the process of environmental review records to be completed correctly, so they do not have to be repeated.
Thanks, Rebecca. That's an excellent point. There are several states that part of the application process is submission of an environmental review record. So they're looking at it prior to even a review of the application itself. So what Rebecca says is we built in the opportunity and providing information on what that project description would read as and what your project is if it was awarded. So we'll move on to the determination level of review. In terms of we've aggregated the project, we know what the project is, we have a description. I would encourage you, even if it's in the actual application, to have discussions. And as we move through this, I want you to keep in mind that adjustments, revisions, changes to your project, activities, dollar amounts, location, can really complicate the project in terms of how it relates to the environmental review record that is cleared, especially. So talk to your program rep. If you're working with an administrating, or if you're an elected or a clerk, an official of that community, you want to make sure there's an understanding, because changes can make a difference if you move from one site to another, which causes extreme complications. Determination of level review. So we'll talk about the level of review in terms of these layers. There are some that take probably an hour to write up and review. It may take longer to actually have those parties, the preparer and the RE, sign off and date than it does to do the review. So for example, a planning grant. Well, when we get into it, that's exempt. You have category excluded, not subject to, which deals with some very specific activities. You have category excluded subject to, which, depending upon how it moves through the process, can convert to exempt. You have EA, which is an environmental assessment, which goes through the lengthier process, which takes significant time. I would encourage you, as you move through and make your determination of level of review, if you're unsure, talk to your program rep so that your environmental review record does not cause delays in terms of the project being cleared and moving to a release of funds. There's an environmental impact statement, an EIS, which is one we're not touching. Those projects are way beyond the scope of what we're financing. And if we would run into one of those, it's a barrier, and it's a lengthy period of time to clear. So if you're there, we're not doing. EA is the environmental assessment. So you have exempt, category excluded, not subject to, category excluded, subject to, and an EA. So moving on. There is a form on determination of level of review. And as you move through and you sign off, and there is a project description that you'll provide. And as you note on the form, there's 3 lines. So usually there's an attachment of the project description along with the illustration, which is usually a map with a key to it that identifies what's illustrated on the map, so that we can recognize where the project is and where those improvement locations are, which would tie directly back to your application when you presented a project map and illustrated the location of those activities. They may not be the same because your application review may not accept all of those improvements that you located. And those, in most cases, happen, in my experience, with streets in a community. Then you would check which level of review you determined to undertake. And then the preparer would sign off in the responsible entity, and it would date it. So this is the first step with the first dates in terms of execution. So when you move on, unless you're dealing with exempt, those dates are not able to be the same as you move forward. This is one of the common errors that we find as we move into the execution by the responsible entity. And if you'll notice on the DLR at the far right, there is spacing. You need to identify from that exempt form or any of those others and fill out the full citation that's in NEPA in terms of how it's classified. And also remember to check the box. If you don't, it's incomplete. Unsigned, it's incomplete. And make sure you put the actual agreement number on it. Anything, Rebecca?
Yes, so
Or Aaron?
everyone, yes, it's Rebecca here. So you complete your project description, and then you're going to use that project description, and you're going to go to 24 CFR 58.34, and you're going to compare that project description to see what you're describing in your description, does that meet the definition of exempt? And then you're going to either be yes or no. If it is a no, you're going to move on to the next level of the environmental review record. So that would be a CE and ST. So you're going to take a look at 24 CFR 58.35B, and you're going to read through those citations, and you're going to be like, am I doing any of these activities? Yes or no. If you say yes, you can stop. You're completing that type of environmental review record. But if you say no, you go on to the next higher one. So these incrementally get a little bit more complicated. So exempt is the easy, and then EA is very complex and usually is brand new construction. So always go back to the 24 CFR Part 58, review this, compare it with your project description to determine if what activities you are doing and which environmental review record aligns with that. And when we come back from break, I'll show you guys where the CFR is located at, and you can take a look at that. I believe we included a copy of it in our manual, but I'll double check that before we go in there. And then the signature and dating process that Steve referenced on this form is you'll see on the very bottom, there's two boxes, the preparer name signature, and then also the responsible entity certifying officer. So one of the key things that we look at is if we see that the responsible entity signed and dated this form first, we are assuming that he signed a blank form. So the preparer always needs to sign the form first, then it is the responsible entity signing it. Hopefully that all makes sense. Aaron, do you have anything to add, or Steve?
No, I'm done. Go ahead,
I'm
Aaron.
glad you mentioned that on the dating. We do want to prepare to date that first. So, thank you.
So it is also helpful as we move forward and you look at the forms, it'll give you a listing. For example, if you do an exempt form, it'll list how and what you need to check and why it's exempt. So the forms help you out. As Rebecca said, you'll want to look in the manual, and in the manual, it lists out those items that are covered under exempt, category excluded, not subject to, and subject to. And those two I would ask you to look at carefully. And if you have a undecided on which way to take it, contact us because it can be a little fuzzy when you're looking at it and you have lack of experience in doing that. And then the EA is what is not included in the other three. So it catches what else there is. So if it's not exempt, not CENST, not CEST, then it should be an EA. So as Rebecca said, look at that and also go to our chapter to give you a review of the listings under those categories. Let's move on. Thanks, Rebecca and Aaron, for giving that review. So here's just a brief bullet points in terms of bubbles, providing that information. As we've mentioned, describe the project, aggregation of all activities, even if they're not part of the CDBG project, they may be part of it in another means, the local level or another funding agency, and have an impact. Select the type of review, and you can find that in our manual, or as Rebecca said, in the in NEPA regs too. And sign prior to completing other forms in terms of the statutory checklist especially. So first the preparer signs, dates, then the responsible entity signs and dates, which may happen on the same day, but the statutory checklist cannot be executed on the same day. It's unreasonable to consider that the preparer of the environmental review record was able to achieve that on the same day, especially if you're working with an EA and you have SHPO or other or tribal comments coming in. So it doesn't happen. So it's very upsetting when that happens. Move on. We've talked quite a bit about exempt CNST, CST, EA, and EIS. So here's references in terms of, as Rebecca said, where you can find those in the 24 CFR. And if you're on the other two webinars, as I always mention, it's helpful to make sure you're looking at the ECR in terms of the electronic version. Maybe that's the ECRF, but you can always look when you do that search which version. Sometimes a version will pull up one by a law firm or whichever, which covers everything, but I always look at the electronic version. Next. Okay, here's a listing of exempt activities. We would find planning, administration, management, and you would find engineering, design cost, imminent threat, CEST projects that convert to exempt, and we'll talk about that. So public services, and that's have to be very careful when it comes to public services, whether they're exempt or they're CES and category excluded, not subject to. So when you get into that area, make sure you talk to us. Next. And Rebecca and Aaron, you're welcome to add comments as we move through these. Category excluded, not subject to activities, supportive services, which could be in the area of health and other operating costs, home buyer with home buyer assistance, which may include as a component of that, down payment and closing costs, supplemental assistance. So there's a number of items and they'd be listed also on that form. Next. Category excluded subject to, this takes care of acquisition, demolition, rehabilitation, construction, removal of architectural barriers. And next. Oh, it did say repairs in there. Remember, repairs is not the language you want to use. An EA is one that includes those items that are not included in the list prior. So anything that's omitted, you would look at. And I would encourage you to look at the chapter and then go to the reference on the 24 CFR. If you go back one. Very good. Thanks, Amber. If you look at these in terms of CEST, public facilities improvements and repairs, there are certain qualifiers. Depends upon 20% of something, significance of the rehab, the number of units, how it addresses public infrastructure versus facilities versus housing. So you want to take a look in carefully at the project in terms of what's taking place. If it's new built, brand new community center, daycare center, it's going to be an EA. If it's on undeveloped land, if it's a renovation, it may be CST or it may be EA. So you want to make sure you look at some of those stipulations. Any comments on that, Aaron, from your experiences?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
So like, sorry,
Rebecca,
Steve.
did we mention your name?
No, we did not.
Go
But
ahead, though.
I warned you I'd be interrupting. So like one of the examples that Steve's referring to is if you go to the CFR, and we do have a copy of this in our appendix section 2, and I'm looking at page 38 of it. But again, always go to the electronic one just to verify everything's still good. So facilities improvements are in place and will not be changed in size or capacity by more than 20%. So that's when you really need to work with your engineer, maybe who was helping you with the application preparation, to say how much of the renovation improvements will be increasing. So if you're adding on to the physical location by more than 20%, it's going to knock it up to the next level of environmental review record. So again, this is what is on the slide is a summary. Always refer back to that CFR reference and read through it, compare it with your project description, have a full comprehension of what you are doing with the proposed CDBG project. Thanks, Steve.
Oh, I know, you're welcome, Rebecca. Thank you. And that's a good point. What I would also encourage you to keep in mind that a change of use makes a large difference in terms of if that property was agricultural and is changed to residential, or if the building on there is a change of use, that can have an impact and it may move from a CEST to an EA. So it's not only, as Rebecca said, how much of that is happening to it, but it's also if it all is making a difference in terms of how it's being used. So that's a significant piece too. We can go ahead now, Amber. Thanks.
And Steve, I just wanted to add one thing there. We have had some situations where they come in with a CEST and it should have been an EA, and that just delays that project so much longer. And so just if there's any questions on that, please let us know. We'll get together and make sure we have the right review, and then we can go further without those delays. That makes a big difference to get that correct.
That's a good comment, Aaron, because Aaron works, has responsibilities with a number of the public works opportunity, and in his portfolio, he's seen a significant number of situations where even during the implementation process, if the community decides not to use the site and building and move to another site for that property and for that activity function, it causes a complete redo in most cases with regards to the environmental review. And there are, as we go forward, timelines are significant difference between CEST and EA. So I encourage you to look at that as far as the layout, the flow chart, and you'll see that it does take a significant amount of time, and it can cause delays even up to 30 days or more as we move through that, especially if you have to go back to SHPO and you haven't been there with the project, or looking at the tribals, or if it moves into an area where there's a floodplain or wetlands that are impacted, or if it has noise that's wasn't anticipated before. Let's move forward. So we can keep going forward, Amber. And as we mentioned, those are projects that are not in those other. All projects are categorized under 24 CFR. Those that it says a cover sheet. I don't know, Rebecca, are we still asking for cover sheets?
No, not to be
Okay.
submitted with us, but if they want to have it within their personal record, they can.
Yeah, we don't need a cover sheet. It's another piece of paper, plus it's another upload and it's another part of the PDF. We just need to know the determination of level of review form, the finding of exempt activity, and the checklist. Now, these are for exempt projects only. So you have your DLR, you'll have the form for exempt, and you'll have the 58.6 checklist, which you haven't visually seen yet. Let's go forward. And then when you get to,
Steve, we did receive a question.
okay,
Just going back to our CEST section that we were on. So to clarify, if a project is renovating a facility and also adding new construction that is less than 20% of the entire site, does an EA need to be executed?
did they want an answer?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. If the addition doesn't reach, and it depends, one, is it on the same footprint in terms of the lot property? Because if they've added property to it in terms of acquisition, then we have another issue. But because you're expanding that property. But if it's, say, an expansion of the building less than 20% and they needed to add space to it, I would not consider that to be an EA as long as the use remains the same, the function remains the same, and it doesn't really increase the footprint of that property or that building. So you'd want to talk to your program rep as you move forward with that. But in most cases, it would still say as a CEST.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome. Great, we had a question. Okay, let's move on. CEST, forget the cover sheet. You're going to do a determination of level review. There'll be a statutory checklist that you'll go through. The 58.6 is always required. The statutory checklist is when we look at that one, and there's 14 items on it, authorities. Depending upon how you review and go through that, there may be sending you on to, in terms of that project, to exempt. You need source documentation, of course, and we do have an excellent piece that Aaron put together as a sample on source documentation. And when we get into the statutory checklist and source documentation, please remember, you do not need to provide 52 pages of charts and tables that do not refer to your project, but refer nationally to other states. We're looking at how it directly impacts in terms of Nebraska, the location, whether that's wild and scenic rivers, whether that deals with aquifers and those cases, and coastal zones, which we don't have. But there'll be a notice of intent and request for release of funds publication. There's a timing worksheet. There's an affidavit of posting if it goes through the entire process. And there's a certification and maybe an 8-step, just depends, and maybe a tier 2, it just depends. But usually on a CEST, we look at it, most cases, it would be project specific, but there may be those activities that trigger a tier 2. Let's go
And then
forward.
Steve,
Yes.
Steve, I just want to highlight the ROF certification form. So in the past, we used to require our subrecipients to submit to us the original environmental review record to the department. And that was a lot of paperwork, a lot of postage on you guys. We have since determined, and with the use of our new grant management system, that everything can be uploaded electronically, including that ROF cert, but we still need the original signed certification form from the responsible entity. So we cannot give release of funds until we have that original form sent to us. So we did have guidance on how to submit special conditions within AMPLA fund, and within that guidance, we informed everyone that they should send an email to and attach the ROF cert form to us and indicate that it's been placed in the mail. So that starts our count for our timing count for the department agency, which we'll get into a little bit more, but it is extremely important that we have the original submitted to us. So please remember that. Amber, you can go on to EA.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca. And as you'll notice, it's also highlighted in here in terms of that original submitted to us, wet ink. So determination level review will be provided. There'll be that 58.6 checklist included, source documentation, timing summary. There is a comment period that's different in terms of looking at the category excluded subject to versus an EA. So you want to be aware of the distinctions in the comment periods as you move forward. There is a 15-day public notice. There'll be a notice at the local level and a notice at the state level. And then there may be an 8-step process, and there could be a tier 2, depends upon the situation there. So this just gives you a listing of those forms that are placed within our manual appendix. And remember, and I think, Rebecca, is this a good time to show them the website, or do you want to do it later?
We'll do it later.
Okay, so Rebecca later will show you our website with regards to the location of these actions for exempt, category excluded, not subject to, and EA, and the actual forms as templates that are on our website. Okay, moving forward. So statutory checklist. We want to talk about that. It's 58.5. There's 14 listed regulatory authorities on that checklist. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so on the checklist, you'll see that you'll need to fill that out as who you are and what the number is of who you are. So there's a subrecipient. That's the grantee listed here. It's a subrecipient. And then the subrecipient's agreement number, what's been identified, if it's 21 PW 008, whatever that may be. Then you'll want to make sure you go through this listing of these 14 authorities and provide the source documentation necessary, and we'll explain that. And you will identify if it's an A or a B. And at the bottom of that checklist, it tells you what an A and a B mean. So as we go through, let's move through the checklist items. Then we'll look at the EA as we move forward in terms of the statutory checklist, environmental assessment. Let's go to the next slide. So there's also an environmental assessment checklist. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and was also emphasized by Rebecca and Aaron, the determination of level of review is dated when the entity and the preparer decides what review level, the entity signs off in agreement, and then you move to the next stage. So if you're moving into doing an environmental assessment, you would be looking at that statutory checklist and you would complete that, but you also need to complete the environmental assessment checklist before you sign off on the statutory and the 58.6. So as you move through, this is an assessment within a number of impact categories, providing source documentation. Now, in that middle column, It says adverse, beneficial, and no impact. So please, if it is beneficial, identify that it's beneficial and why. And then you'll want to provide documentations, source documentation, but you also want to provide, if needed to, if it's adverse, why it's adverse. And maybe there's a specific reason in terms of noise that has to be mitigated as you move through that, or it takes property out of agricultural into residential, and if it's prime farmland, there's an issue, but let's move forward. So this assessment will help you make a determination of whether or not that project is going to move forward. So in terms of a checklist, CEST and EA, there's 14 regulatory executive orders that come under the statutory checklist. You want to go through and you can look at those that are easy to do. And we provide that information in the manual, and even one of them's already filled out in terms of the checklist, which coastal zone management doesn't apply here in Nebraska. Maybe there will be a coastal zone here in a few centuries. The scope and nature. So look at those are the easy ones to go through, and then identify those that you know you'll either need to do follow-up with authorities, whether it happens to be going to FEMA's website and looking for the map that deals with floodplains, whether it's going to SHPO and finding out whether or not that property has historic significance, and whether or not you know, well, there's a lot of noise in this area. How does the noise impact? Because my property is right next to the railroad. So there's a number of items that depend upon how it's used too, the type of use, whether noise has an impact. So do what's easy first, and then you always want to take into consideration not only those other resources, but you also want to take into consideration locally those resources that have an awareness of the community, how the property is impacted by what surrounds it, and also the fact that how that property affects what's surrounding it. So whether it's a building official or public works, because on-site evaluation in a number of cases is extremely important. You may go to the state fire marshal and look at underground storage and tanks and so forth. But if you go there to the site and you find out there's considerable amount of oil coming from somewhere, or if you know it's a superfunded site, there's some significant causes for maybe not to be located there. So focus on those that are most important, that have the greatest impact. Those that usually, as I mentioned, require review, floodplain management, SHPO consultation, tribal consultation. If it's in a floodplain or associated with it, depends upon if it's incidental or significant, and you move into the situation where you may have to do an 8-step. And remember, it's floodplain and wetlands. And then the statutory checklist, you're ensuring that the project is compliance with all those authorities when that's signed off. And also when you get into the 58.6 next. Questions at this point, Amber?
No new questions. Oh wait, we did have one that came through. So in a village, who qualifies as an expert? Most of this size of jurisdiction have part-time staff at best.
Can you repeat that?
In a village, who qualifies as an expert? Most of this size of jurisdictions have part-time staff at best.
Who qualifies? Well, that
Yeah.
depends upon the individual's role and how their familiarity is with the community. So if you have, for example, an unmapped community in terms of floodplain, it may be that those persons in the community know how to make a determination on whether that community has been flooded in the past or not. It may be that the actual preparer of the ER, the environmental review record, needs to go to that site and conduct a review of that site, an on-site evaluation, according to looking for those items on the checklist that would make a difference to the property. And it may be that there is no one in the community that qualifies. We don't have a qualifier. So in a community where they have a building and inspection department, public works department that deals with a number of factors, if permits are issued, we don't have a "you are qualified" stamp of approval. Would you want to comment on that, Aaron, in your experience?
Yeah, sometimes it's helpful if you can get the fire chief to go out there and maybe walk the property, and also somebody who has lived in the community for all their life. They may know that there used to be a dry cleaner at this location or something like that they may have knowledge about, but other people might not. So there could be some resources even in a small village that you could take advantage of.
So it's goes back to that person knowing what to look for as an observer. So if they see something unusual on the property or near the property, it may require someone to do further investigation. So as Aaron says, in some of the smaller villages, it may not be able to do so. But a lot of times those that work at the fire department may have a pretty good handle upon what the public safety issues are in that community. So we don't have a clear cut who's qualified or not qualified. But as you move up in terms of levels of a responsibility in a community, you have a better feeling for those that can do an on-site review and provide that assessment to attach to the statutory checklist in terms of what was reviewed. Rebecca, do you have anything to add?
Nothing to add to that question, but I do want to preface before you get into the next couple of slides for everyone is we are now going into the 14 regulations and we're giving, oh, Amber, we can see your email. We are showing you the 14 regulations that you are reviewing in association for projects that are CEST or EA. And we will go over these fairly quickly, but we did provide a lot of information so then you could use this as a resource when you are conducting your own environmental review records. So, and after the break, I'll show you some of these website links that I have referenced on each one of these slides, but I'll turn it over to Steve to explain all the regulations.
Thanks, Rebecca. And just to clarify, as Rebecca said, we're not going to go into a lot of depth and explanation because there are several slides moving forward. So these items are listed in the statutory checklist, the Clean Air Act, and there's your resource for dealing with that in terms of air contamination. So if your project is right next to a smokestack that spews a lot of fumes, you may want to need to take that into consideration. And as we go through these, there's a number of factors. Distance that makes a difference, and then the level of one of these as it applies, especially in decibels and noise. But let's go forward. So you want to document this, the determination that conversion of land and so forth, how that is impacted by what is surrounding them in terms of air quality for someone to live there. Management districts, the non-attainable maintenance status for certain pollutants, emission levels for those types of pollutants. It's a non-attainment area. So usually when you look at that air quality, you're looking at the non-attainment area, which you would find in that website link. Go ahead. We'll talk about airport hazards too. If you've seen that commercial where the persons they open their window and that jet flies towards them? I don't remember what commercial it is, but when you're looking at that, we don't want the property to be developed in the airport as far as the right of ways, as far as the air path moves through that. So you want to make sure on the distance and the locations, you can find out where that is on the HUD exchange dealing with airport regulations and those that are identified. You'll want to make sure that you measure the distance. Go to the next slide. You want to identify in terms of what I was thinking, it was a runway clear zone, the number of feet from the runway, and that's a straight line distance. So you don't want to build in the runway clear zone. We've had properties that were adjacent to, but based upon the nature of the property improvement, there was no impact. Is your project within 15,000 feet of a military airport? Now, maybe that has more significance than a civil airport in terms of the type of planes and
Steve.
flights that go. Yes.
We did receive a question on what's the best way to measure the distance from the runway clear zone.
I think if you go to the site and you walk it off in terms of steps. No?
I don't think that's it.
Yeah, I know. It's hard to throw humor into these webinars when I can't see people and I don't recognize. But from what I've reviewed, and Eric can step into this too, is that you measure in terms of the distance from point A to point B. So whatever that distance is, shortest, a straight line distance, because you would have to look at where it is in terms of where it begins in terms of the airport runway clear zone and where that property ends. So it's the closest points that you would be measuring. Did you have anything on that, Aaron?
Oh, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, usually it's not an issue. Sometimes it might be. If it gets to that point, just get with us and we'll walk through it with Google Earth or whatever we can come up with.
And oftentimes you consult with the airport manager. One of the examples I'm going to use is from the city of Columbus. They actually, in order for their designation as an airport, they had to buy houses near them for demo because they were in the airport hazard time frame there for their designation. So that would be something that you would need to consult with the airport manager. I believe they're all listed on the webpage. I'll have to go look that up again. But definitely don't just make this determination on your own. Consult with people. You don't know what plans are for those airports yourself. It's definitely something you have to reach out and do consultations with.
You don't want to be in the position of Midway Airport in Chicago, where the residential property is right around the fencing. But anyway, if you've ever flown in and out of Midway or O'Hare or other major airports. But yes, I would do, as Rebecca says, consultation with whoever manages the airport. I don't know how many flights go in and out, but you never know nowadays. So it is a distance measurement from the closest points is how I would do it of the property. That makes a difference in terms of where that a runway clear zone is. And they, I believe, have different zones when it comes to the airports. Hopefully that answers the question. I'll move on. So this gives you some more information about where to find those maps. and what that relates to in terms of documentation that we've spoken about. Let's move on. And more information and distinction about designation of and how often that facility is used. And as mentioned, you need to talk to the airport operator. And if that airport has, for example, what I would look options on property or easements, you may want to ask them if this map is current and how far out they range in terms of maybe looking at runway development and increasing their activities at that airport, such as I believe some have expanded, like say, for example, Grand Island, I know. Go ahead, next. Coastal zone management, easy one. As we mentioned, do what's easy first. That should actually be pre-filled. So we don't have any coastal zone management issues here. Move on.
Hey, before you move on, we do have example language. If you go back real quick, Amber. We have an example of the statement you can use within your statutory checklist there, and it's in bold statement, no coastal zone management programs exist in the state region. Go ahead and copy and paste that. Super easy. Okay, move on to the next slide.
Contamination and toxic substances. Lead, asbestos, radon, any of those types, were any of the sites or nearby toxic, hazardous, radioactive substance found that could affect the health and safety of those occupants or conflict with the intended use of the property. There is a link if you have the opportunity and wish to go to the HUD Exchange, and there is a significant amount of very informative information that deals with environmental review and these topics that we're moving through to go through. And there are training slides on videos on that HUD Exchange site for the environmental review record that would help you if you want to continue your education in that area. So you may go to what they call Sanborn sites, Sanborn maps, which go way back in terms of insurance records that were maintained many years ago, maybe in the 20s, 1920s. That would give you an indication. You can also, as Aaron mentioned, persons that are aware of prior use of sites. It was an abandoned station that provided fuel for vehicles that had combustible engines as such. So that's important. Any type of site that was used, storage and so forth. Let's move on.
And just another example, so for my mind and historical knowledge, I'm originally from Columbus. I know that there was contamination done from local dry cleaners site, so that would be something that you would need to look into also, especially if you were doing owner-occupied rehab or new construction, just being aware of that.
So here's some more information. They must be free of those types of toxic substances, contamination. There are Superfund sites in the state of Nebraska. When it comes to, you may want to talk to DEE. State Department deals with environment and energy in terms of if they have some knowledge. There may have been a site that was closed many years ago that was a landfill as such, and might be unknowing except to the local residents or of records. So use whatever you need to make a determination of if that site has contamination or toxic substances And that's not the site specific, it's also what's surrounding the site and how that would impact the occupants of that site that's being developed, whether it's a community center, a senior center, or residential development that takes place. Next. So when you do the statutory checklist, it's good to go through and identify the references and sources and provide those as attachments. Now, what I strongly encourage you to do is in the statutory checklist where you fill this information out on the right-hand columns, identify attachment number 1, 2, 3, and then when you provide those sources, also identify on those sources if that's attachment 1, and that attachment 1 actually ties back to attachment 1 as a source document in the statutory checklist. So that's very important too there as far as that goes. There may be that phase 1 or phase 2 is done on the property too. And we won't go into details about that here, but those are avenues that maybe the lender wants to have happen if they're looking at, they've purchased the property. And usually, and in most cases, when we look at CDBG in the state of Nebraska, that property needs to be held by not being purchased prior to or during the process. Next. And you may have to identify as you go through these statutory checklists, the mitigation, what needs to be done, what permits need to be secured as you move through the process. The Endangered Species Act, that's important. There's a link there, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You can also check in with Game and Parks to find out in terms of what they've identified. Recently in the paper, there are less endangered species now since they've all died off, whether they're animals, plants, herbicides, or insects, or whatever the case may be. So you want to identify that because what happens, it's significant in terms of, let's go to the next slide. It's significant in terms of endangered species dependent upon the time of year. So in terms of their habitat, it may be that construction doesn't take place during this period because this species of bird happens to nest in that area. And during that time period, you don't want to disturb them. So there are significant times, and that needs to be identified within the statutory checklist when you look at what actions you're going to take to potentially prevent from, for example, during that time period, disturbing those species as such. And it all depends upon the type of activity that's taking place too. Next. And there are those species that are listed on the endangered species list, and especially if those are located in there, you want to identify those. It may have no effect, may have likely to adversely affect. So there's a number of levels that you would go to in terms of your actions. And you'd want to list those species that are protected. Next. And here's some level of documentation. No effect, may affect, likely to end their life, adversely affect. Next.
And so when you,
okay, just a minute, Rebecca.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not reading to you, and maybe Rebecca said this in the beginning, we talked about this before this event. We're not reading to you all the items on the slides, the presentation, because these are also your resources. So if you are expecting me to read verbatim, that is not my purpose or objective. The department's objective in the presentations are to provide you with the resources and the sources that you can use when you carry out the ER, the environmental review. Go ahead, Rebecca. Thank you.
I just wanted to add that please pay attention when you are evaluating everything. You might get a response from one of these agencies saying, yep, your project's fine, but please complete the following items before construction begins, such as don't do any construction in the months of April, May, because it might affect the habitation for this specific animal. I know we've gotten other responses back where they asked for more information so they could evaluate, and the preparer of the environmental review record did not even read the response. They checked it off as I got a response back. I'm going to just continue moving forward. It's very vital for you to review the responses back and ensure that there was not additional information requested from that agency to be conducted prior to construction of the project. Okay, Steve, all you.
Thank you. And also remember that on a statutory checklist, when you list those items, that the department has a responsibility to challenge what you state. So in terms of challenging, we're actually assisting and improving how you're responding to those 14 authorities and the other three that are in 58.6. And one of those is floodplain management and floodplain insurance. So we're also assisting in the environmental review process, because at some point there will be that request on the environmental for release, and we sign off on those. So it's extremely important that it's clear in the review when HUD reviews the environmental review record, and if the state auditors would review the process that we undertake. So that's one of the reasons two of the reasons, and there's other reasons, but why we're being helpful. Let's put it that way. Okay, next.
Hey, Steve, we did receive a question. Are owner-occupied rehab projects no effect on endangered species because they are existing building renovations on interior and exterior?
That depends. If the endangered species resides within that facility, there may be an issue.
So one example.
But in most cases, they wouldn't, unless you're doing some exterior renovation to that building that would cause on-site work. This would be an extreme to disturb a population that is considered to be endangered. Go ahead, Rebecca.
So one example I would hear from our housing representatives at DED is that bats were a main item for concern, especially here in the city of Lincoln. They do reside here. So that would be something you would need to take into account. And oftentimes they provide you guidance of don't mess with anything during the months of April and May if you are doing something. And if you do find something, let us know.
So if bats reside in your attic of the property, in the attic of the property that you're rehabbing, you may want to call those persons that remove them safely. But it could affect, as mentioned, rehab projects. And it depends upon the level of activity that takes place also on the property, and I would say outside of the property more so than on interior rehab. So if you're doing roof repairs, siding, foundation on the outside, or if tearing down a property that might be a outbuilding on that property and removing it, there could be consideration of a species that might be endangered by the activity that you're undertaking. I don't think raccoons are, but anyway. Anything else, Rebecca?
Nope, that's it for me.
Okay, you want to move on? So speaking of bats, here's your question on conservation conditions when we come to northern long-eared bats. These are the ones that have long ears. So there are those species that could be impacted because if you're aware, I mean, in our neighborhood, we see bats at night flying around. That when you get to the sun setting period, well, actually, the sun doesn't set, the earth rotates, never mind. But when you look at this, take that into consideration, even if you're doing owner-occupied rehab or even commercial rehab, where there may be property that's next to maybe a park, an open development of land that's significant. Okay, next. Environmental justice, that's usually not an issue with communities, but there's a means to make sure that the improvement on that property, the actual activity that's undertaking doesn't impact people unfairly. And as it says, the human health, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income. So the location of a project for development, you need to look at how environmental justice and human health, and there is a resource as a website. In most cases, in the communities we've worked in, I haven't found where that's been an issue with regards to that. But we do have communities with populations that if all of those activities that were harmful to their health were located only within that area, that would be an issue for one. Next. And here are some questions that you can ask in terms of adverse effects on the environment and those persons that are part of that environment in that community. Next. And those types of sites that you can review, and there's a link that provides that to you in terms of talking to, maybe you talk to the health department, the school district, if you need to find out the location of those neighborhoods. And maybe it's a familiarity that the persons that live in the community have with those representative groups that live there also. And that's why you need to understand that the environmental record is a public document. Next. And here's some documentation that you can go through if you need to look at those projects in terms of environmental justice of concern with regards to demographics, income, minority populations. Next. Explosives and flammable operations. It's best not to have a project located next to the opportunity where maybe there would be an explosion from what's there in terms of flammable materials are stored on site, chemicals, propane, whatever that may be, and hydrous ammonia, any types of conventional fuel. So you want to make sure that not only talking to and information from the fire marshal or from national, looking at where those would be located. And this is where an on-site inspection by a person most knowledgeable about those types of visuals that they can provide where that property is located. Next. And you're asking the question about above ground stationary storage tanks. And here's a good listing in terms of whether you're working with residential or rehabilitation. 1 mile of the project site. And there are some actual thresholds, 100-gallon capacity of liquid industrial fuels, different types of gases. You want to make sure there is a separation distance. And if that distance is not acceptable, there's a barrier to mitigate. So, for example, to build a daycare center on a site next to a agricultural commodity or a facility that provides fertilizer, anhydrous ammonia, fuels, trucks, you might want to take into consideration whether or not that's the best site to locate a daycare where children are going to be provided with all of those opportunities to learn from other persons and have that social interaction. So separation distance is very important. Also with extending barriers, and that comes into noise too. Next. So you want to make sure that one, that not only are you looking at what's around the site, but what's going to be housed in that site. So it's an economic development project that has and undertakes with, for example, stores hazardous materials that may be flammable or characters for processing of what they're doing. Then you have to look at how does that affect the surrounding in terms of distance and barriers that are available to offset if there would be a toxic explosion or leak. So you may want to talk to, as Aaron said, the fire department, the chief, or those that have a knowledge of how that would affect and what is in the surrounding. Next. Documentation about above ground storage tanks. Physical site review. Make notes. Identify with on your map so that when you do your attachment, you can explain and make a determination that visually you didn't find those or you did find those and how far away they are and where they're located. And then talk about the 1 mile again. 100-gallon capacity of certain liquid industrial fuels. Next. And what that barrier would be if you needed to put a barrier up for mitigation. So as you go through the statutory checklist, you're going to identify those mitigation items and also permits. And the department and the program rep, what they will also do, they'll take your statutory checklist and they will incorporate within that release of funds and environmental clearance. They'll identify what those items are for permits, mitigation, and also what may need to be looked at as the project moves forward that has a potential to need mitigation. Next. Farmland protection, there's a Farmland Protection Act. And you can go through this and look at those websites to minimize effect on federal programs. Usually if it's in the community and it's already property that's developed, it doesn't have an effect on conversion of farmland because it's already been converted and it's already existing. So owner occupied rehab, that's not a tier 2 issue, for example, or commercial because it's already developed. There potentially could be an impact if the property next to them is farmland and the development activity of CDBG happens to be one that's going to require storage of certain products and potential discharge. Next. Documentation here, and you can read through this after the presentation's over. Next. Floodplain management.
Hey, Steve.
Yes.
We're going to take a 10-minute break before you get into floodplain management.
Oh, good. I'm tired of standing.
So I'll return at 10:45.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. Amber, I just want to confirm that you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Perfect, thank you. So before we hop back into the PowerPoint presentation, I wanted to show everyone our webpage again. But if you go to opportunity.nebraska.gov/CDBG, and you'll go all the way down till you get to the expandable folder thingamajigs, and click on forms and templates, and then you'll scroll down and we have a section on environmental review records. So as we discussed earlier in the presentation, there are 5 levels of environmental review records, and each one have specific forms that need to be completed. So if you were completing an exempt, you would have these 3 forms you would complete and submit to the department as a special condition item. Same with CNST, there are these 3 forms. CEST, and as you can tell, they're getting a little bit more complicated. We started off with 3 forms, and now look at how many CEST forms there are that would need to be completed, depending on the type of project you are completing. So if you have questions, and again, feel free to contact your program representative. We do have additional on a page 2, so don't forget to hit that next to make sure that you are completing all the required forms. So here for an EA, additional documentation is also listed there. And then as we stated earlier in the presentation, if you find that your project has bumped up to an environmental impact statement, EIS, please contact your program representative immediately. So take a look at those forms, see if you have any questions. That is one of the main areas that you will get all of the forms from us, and then you would submit those to the department by uploading them to within our grant management system of the Amplifund. So I wanted to also make you aware of another resource called the HUD Exchange. We talked about, I showed you this on webinar 1. Highly recommend that you create a login account for this website, and then also sign up for the listservs. So especially the CDBG state program, environmental review record, they are constantly holding new trainings and providing additional information. You just need to remember that you are handling the state program for the state CDBG. If you have questions, and then also for environmental review, you are Part 58 for any project. So if you want to learn more about environmental review, they have a whole section. You'll just go over here and click environmental review, and it will take you to this web page, which has a ton of resources. So I highly recommend using this as much as possible. We have over here a link to the web-based instructional system for environmental review, WISER. It walks you through each of these regulations in much more detail than what Steve and I are doing during this presentation. Please review this. I've walked through it a couple times now. I always pick up something new every time I watch it. So definitely recommend, if you click on this link, it'll look like this will be brought up. And there are modules, there's little quizzes. Again, you have to have a HUD Exchange login account in order to take these modules. So one thing I do want to highlight here, if you see references to HEROES, the HUD Environmental Review Online System, this is only available to our entitlements. It's not available to state programs. So it does not apply to the program that Nebraska DED is implementing at this point in time, because it's not available to us. And that's something that HUD has determined and still working through. So, but please keep that in mind. And then we also have related federal environmental review, environmental laws and authorities. And it will not open. So we'll go to this. You'll find that a lot of the information you see on our PowerPoint slides is taking you through this. So they have airport hazards here, and it provides you additional information. So they have the WISER module located here to talk you through airport hazards, and especially with some of the questions that we've gotten. And then they also have worksheets for you to fill out to better understand how everything works. Definitely go through this and see how everything works. I believe I did provide this fact sheet to all of you earlier in our handouts. So just open this up real quick, and it walks you through everything here. So you locate the site on on a map in the vicinity, and then you also measure. So, and then they have lovely calculations here. So I wanted to walk you guys through each of that, and I think I've covered all of these items. There is another reference to orientations, environmental reviews. This kind of gives you an overview of everything. If you want to click through this, definitely use the HUD exchange. We here at the department use this all the time. So use the same information that we have access to. It is fair game. And then I just wanted to show you guys the electronic CFR. I pulled up part 58. So, and a lot of our information is in 0.35. So you can walk through this and take a look at everything. So they walk you through all the exempt activities. This is where you would compare your project description to the exempt activities and then see if that project fits this one. If not, then you would continue up a level. So CEST are located here. Definitely use this to help you ascertain what type of environmental review record level you should be completing for a CDBG project. Steve, is there anything else you want me to show or highlight on this?
Yeah, go to the very top.
Oh, of this?
Yes. Okay, and then go down where it says view table of contents. And click on that. So there's a listing. So if you want to find the shortest way to, and you know what you're looking for, this is very helpful in terms of being able to find the table of contents. So, and then I don't know if we have time in terms of the next segment is on floodplain management. There's a FEMA website.
Yep, I'll bring that up, but I'll let you, I'll
No,
have
I just want
Amber,
to make sure. Go ahead.
I'll have Amber share her screen and I'll pull up that website.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Amber, if you want to take over sharing. Maybe.
Okay, I think we're there now, right?
Yep.
Okay. So we want to go into floodplain management. There's an executive order in 24 CFR part 55. So we want to look in, you want to look at the impact that your project would have on floodplains and wetlands. And as mentioned, you want to make sure that you go to FEMA's website and look for the actual mapping that would provide the illustration that identifies based upon the location of the project in terms of the floodplain zones that are affecting that project. And then in the 58.6, there is a piece that deals with flood insurance. Next. There are, as we said, FEMA has issued letters and amendments that category excluded, not subject to, and sites where incidental floodplain exceptions apply. So you want to determine this. If you fall into that situation, contact us if there's you don't understand with regards to that illustration. Next. You'll use a FEMA's flood insurance rate map, which is called a FIRM. And when you go to FEMA's site and you go to that FIRM, there's a number of clicking steps or drop downs that you can actually go to determine and locate this community that you're addressing in terms of the floodplain mapping within the FIRM map, and make sure that when you go to that quadrant of the FIRM map, that it is and covers the location of that project. They provide different levels of floodplain elevations, and you need to have an understanding where and how those affect the project, if it is located within a floodplain. Sometimes they are surrounded by, the project is surrounded by, sometimes it's incidental. If it's not mapped by FEMA, there's no firm map, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation. Best available information that you can provide, and that may be actually historical records and knowledge of those persons that have lived in the community for a period of time and have a clear understanding, and it could be based upon some very significant floods that have taken place over time, which may not be mapped by the firm map, even where those have occurred in a community that was underwater, say along the Missouri River or other tributaries. Next. So if the project occurs in these areas, you want to determine whether you need to go through an 8-step process. The 8-step process, there is a checklist that you would go through to determine whether you're going to complete the 8-step process or possibly move into a 5-step process. And then there's a 2-step process where you check one and you move on. And the second step is you don't have to do anything with regards to floodplain management. Next. So complete the 8-step process, and then you want to make sure that you identify what mitigation needs to take place. Next. When it comes to the statutory checklist, the environmental review record demands that a FEMA map be provided if a FEMA map is available. So that firm map is the basis of what the environmental review ties to for floodplain management. So if you have a map from another agency or a local hand written map, if there is a firm map, that's what we want. We want that FEMA map. And we want you to identify clearly on the map the location of that property. And if you need to provide an explanation in terms of maybe a part of the property is in the floodplain that needs to be taken care of. So we'll determine and work with you if it's an incidental location or part of a location, especially when it comes to infrastructure where a pipeline, for example, for water, sewage may cross through, because that's through a floodplain. That's also an item that needs to be taken care of in terms of mitigation. If it may cut a corner of a floodplain, very incidental, you may not need to go through the 8-step. Next. Historic preservation. It's SHPO, State's Historic Preservation Office, which is History Nebraska. There is an online form. And if you know your project, this is a part of the process. On some opportunities, we say you really need to talk to SHPO ahead of time. So when we do, for example, tourism development, economic development, you may say, well, one of your steps is you really need to connect with SHPO to begin with, to help you out to have an understanding of whether or not that property has historic significance, whether by the age of the property, by who resided in that property, or by events that occurred on that property. So there's a number of features, 3 components of that historic preservation. And SHPO is very good, so go ahead, make sure that you provide them with what they're looking for in terms of photos, locations, descriptions, and that those photos actually just depict the property that's being, for example, renovated. And there is a checklist on tribal historic preservation that you'll want to go through to determine whether or not you need to contact the tribal historic preservation officer in terms of consulting parties. And that doesn't mean that they have ownership of the land within the community or where that property is, that can go back in terms of years, in terms of how that activity influences what that property that has a relationship with that tribe. So do the checklist. If you're unsure, talk to us next. So for those two components, don't overlook it. This is a Section 106 review. As we mentioned, History Nebraska, there's an online, you can do that. If you're disturbing, digging up the ground in terms of the property, there may be a requirement for an archaeological survey, or they may say based upon when you undertake the project, you may need to do one or undertake one. It just depends on the nature of the project, the location, and there are guidelines that deal with archaeological sites too. So that can be recognized by SHPO. And they may ask you to look at it later on, and if that's the case, you need to make sure that that's in your statutory checklist in terms of what needs to happen during the project related to SHPO review. And we'll take a look and we'll carry that forward also next. So there's a form to fill out online. If you have questions, just talk to SHPO about how to do that. That's their preference in terms of submission, and that provides you a timely response. And you can't move forward until you have the 106 review done. Next. And here gives you the reasons why you do the Tribal Historic Preservation Office in terms of tribal review. And this has been added specifically to the environmental review record in the last, unsure number of years, but it was a part of it over many years, but it's been it's explicit now, it's identified. So for when it comes to those, there's two parts. There's a SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, and then there's a Tribal Historic Preservation Office under Historic Preservation. So please do not skip either one of those. Next. Consultation, yeah, go ahead.
If Amber wants to flip back to the prior PowerPoint slide, just want to highlight this note. On HUD's website, they specify that only the certifying official of the responsible entity, your chief elected official, may initiate tribal consultation. Other parties, so if you are not that chief elected official, you shouldn't be the one initiating the consultation. It should be with your chief elected official with that tribal entity. So please keep that in mind. That's something that HUD references on their website on how to consult with the tribal preservation officer. And they do have a website that lists the tribal preservation officers. You can search by location for that. And also we did do a webinar with the State Historical Preservation Officer, and I'll send you guys the direct YouTube video. We did that back in 2019, so for your further learning. But Steve, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you.
You're welcome, Rebecca. That's extremely important, and I can't guarantee that all will have tribal historic preservation officers at the time you look at their site, but at least you know of record which ones to contact in terms of consultation. And the other part of that is usually SHPO, History Nebraska, will reply, and sometimes the tribals, you may or may not receive a reply within the time period you're hoping. So you can move on, but if they reply, you need to take in consideration their reply. So if there is, go ahead.
And I would recommend sending more than one correspondence, so maybe something got lost in the mail, both with the SHPO and the tribal officer. So the SHPO has 30 days. If you're getting close to 30 days and you have not heard a response, I would still reach out and see if they can give you an update. Tribal, there is no time frame. So be kind. Don't just assume one and done. Issue reminders. You want to make sure you are being conscientious of your environmental review record and the impact that your project has on this. So thank you.
Anything else, Rebecca?
Nope.
Okay, so for the tribal, there is a checklist. Use that checklist and use that checklist as part of your support documentation for your environmental review record. And also make sure that on the SHPO side, on historic preservation with History Nebraska, that you provide that response form with one of your source documentations besides what you've submitted to them requesting the information. So let's move on. So as we mentioned, we've talked through a number of these items already in terms of, and most times there'll be no historic properties affected. So you'll find this information has responded not within 30 days. I'd get back to them directly, clarification if you need to, especially if you really need to move that ER along quickly in terms of one of the steps as far as the statutory checklist. So 30 days, and they're good about, but everybody has other challenges in terms of workload too. So next. And that's the same thing there when you're getting into documentation of no adverse effects. So you want to identify that on your statutory checklist, that there's no adverse effect, and you'll want to identify who you contacted and why, and then you'll want to list out the attachment for the resource. And if you went to a website, you want to list those websites and the name of them on that statutory checklist. Move forward next. And hopefully for most cases, you will not be dealing with the advisory council on historic preservation with regards to adverse effects. So it is a consultation process, and the SHPO provides those recommendations or advisory to whether or not there isn't an adverse effect. So if you want to challenge that, if they said there is and it would halt the project, there's mechanisms within the system with the advisory council, but I would hope and anticipate that the project wouldn't go in that direction. And you'll see why in what's listed here. Next. Noise control. Right now, hopefully you can't hear the background noise of somebody drilling within the building, but we talk about noise control or the impact of noise on the property and whatever noise is generated after the project is developed and put in place operation on the surrounding area. There is a resource, potential noise, major roadways, railways, any type of regulated airfields. So there are distances next. Okay, 65 decibels. That used to be a speed limit also in some parts of the interstate system, but anyway, you need to make sure, and we look at the average 65 decibels when it's measured out, day and night average noise levels above 75 are unacceptable. There will be the nature of that can't move forward unless you find a way to mitigate or to reduce the noise for that property that's being developed. There is a noise calculator. I don't know if it's on the next screen. Okay, so here's a listing here, what's acceptable, normally unacceptable. And when it gets into that range of 65 to 75, you need to be looking at how can we mitigate or reduce the noise. Now, this isn't measuring noise caused by construction on site only or exclusively. So that's an interim, that's the development taking place. Now, you may want to look at when certain items happen based upon the neighbors with regards to the construction, if it affects right next to a senior center or to a other facility in terms of consultation or letting them know what's happening. But there is a noise calculator, and that noise calculator deals with those noises that are contributed by what we saw before, major highways, truck traffic especially, railroads, how often the trains pass through. If you're not in a quiet zone, it's difficult. And then we look at airports, the noise that comes through there. So next. So when we look at this, there's thresholds. And if within these distances, then you need to make sure that the 65 decibel level is reached or less than that. And effective noise barriers if need to be done. Noise generated by the noise normally unacceptable between 66 and 75. Noise attention requirements. Next. So I didn't say, but there is a noise calculator. And as mentioned by Rebecca, you can go to the HUD Exchange and the environmental review, and you can find that noise calculator dealing with and measuring. And if you need assistance, the State Department of Transportation may have some records that can provide you with traffic counts, trucks, and so forth to deal with the noise calculator to help. Railroads, I don't know how much the railroads will provide. I think there is a site that gives that information out too. So water quality, sole source aquifers, in terms of safe drinking water. You need to cite the resource for that. And my understanding with regards to sole source aquifers, we haven't found those. Have you found any, Rebecca or Aaron?
No, not in Nebraska.
Okay.
I haven't.
Good. So everything is all multi-source. So this one is one of those easy ones in terms of water quality and sole source aquifers. So in the beginning, a few months ago, when we started talking about checking the list of what's easy, do what's easy, then move to what needs to be done a little bit more difficult, and then attack those. The most difficult in terms of the statutory checklist, I'd also look at that checklist and see which ones I need to make contact with a specific period of time when you start that process. So don't hold off on making those contacts, but cite the source, and there are no sole sources in Nebraska. Move on. And you can read through that. Let's go on. You can read through it later. Wetlands protection. There is a protection of wetlands. There is a site. You can find those wetlands that are designated. Next slide. And there's documentation you need to provide. It is the 8-step process also in terms of floodplains and wetlands. And wetlands may not be apparent as wetlands. So it's a good idea to do an on-site inspection of the property surrounding the development and the property that's intend to develop for that project, because you want to be aware of observations of that may be a wetland. There may not be water in it now, but on frequencies, there is water on an annual basis. So you look at the ground level, you look at the vegetation, and you look at if you can tell what the soil and so forth, you can visually see that that has the potential to be a wetland. So we don't want to encroach on wetlands since there are a limited number of wetlands and those that are identified. So there's an 8-step process for that. Same as floodplains. Next. Wild and scenic rivers. This is one of the easy ones. You go to the site and you find out if how wild and scenic those rivers are in Nebraska. I believe there's, I don't know, Aaron, are there 2?
They're all up in the far northeast corner of the state, and there's just a few counties that are impacted by this, and so
Right.
most of the projects aren't going to be. It's the Niobrara, and there might be another one. Yeah.
So those are what you would find in terms of provide that documentation, as Aaron said, the location and the source that you found those from. And if you're developing along those wild and scenic rivers, there may be a issue or a problem. I don't even know what the easements are there, but the rest of the rivers in Nebraska are tame and non-scenic. Is that what that means? No, anyway, most of them are scenic. Next. And here's your resources to go to those for wild and scenic rivers. Next. And documentation, provide that. Next. Statutory checklist. So you want to review the guidelines in the manual. You want to review the HUD website. And to become more aware of, go to the WISER. I've done that, the WISER training. We had to complete WISER training and pass all of it, the modules, before we could go to a HUD environmental training review. And to be honest, it took me a few times to get through some of those because they're quite detailed and explanatory. There is a green book on environmental review as a guide. I don't know how often you want to develop and go into that, but my recommendation is our manual and the HUD website in terms of the exchange. Any questions on the statutory checklist? See anything out there, Amber?
Not seeing any.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. And here's some examples of how to use the website. I think Rebecca took you on a guided tour also, and I'd make sure that you go to that. And then there is the FEMA site to go for the firm map. There are other sites that you can go to. I mean, if you want to go to History Nebraska and SHPO and look at properties that are on the National Register, eligible for the National Register, if you're working in those communities that have a designated historic district, it may be a historic district and there may be a historic residential district. I know Fremont has a residential district. If you go down into the Red Cloud area, they have a historic district. So you'll need to make it and have an understanding of those locations. So it's helpful to look ahead. Next. Statutory checklist, some hints. Don't leave anything blank, for one thing. And NA not applicable, or if you think it's not acceptable or not available or whatever it is, you need to put in your response and the source you went to, and you need to identify the attachment. You need to state mitigation permits. You need to state how you reviewed, if it was on site. And I would encourage you, so resolve these issues. Use the language that'll help you meet the compliance. We can provide you some examples, but what I would encourage you to do is, if you're unsure, talk to your program rep about this. This is one of the items that we bounce back and ask the preparer to redo certain components if it doesn't meet our criteria for review or our expectations. Same with the project description. Okay, what's next? Okay, there is an environmental assessment checklist, which we talked about earlier, and that checklist goes through it's only for EA projects. So you'll do the statutory checklist, you'll do the 58.6, you'll continue on into the EA checklist. You're evaluating those projects in terms of site and how they affect persons and how they provide improvements and how maybe they harm or there is no benefit or impact. So there are links there next. Publication and posting. EST and EAs require publication notices. There is a publication and posting and notice of intent to request release of funds on a CEST also. An EA requires publications and posting of a finding of no significant impact on what's called a FONSI and a notice of intent for release of funds. Published concurrently in terms of those, there's a combined notice. So there's a posting that takes place. So if you look at the chart at one time, which I'm sure you printed out and posted besides where you're reviewing, but you'll look at that and you'll see that there's a number of days that are listed out for those. So there are different comment periods, whether it is on the CEST on the 7 to 10 days, or whether it's on the EA where it's 15 to 18. If you post, it's the 3 days longer. If you publish, it's the 7 or 15. So you do need to provide a publication notice that's published into that newspaper of general circulation where the public is going to review that. It doesn't preclude you from posting too, but the publication notice, and you need to make sure that the timing of the publication is correct in terms of the first publication on the EA, and that the second one that is delivered in terms of how the state is going to review. The first publication is a review of the actual environmental review record at the local level, so you need to make sure that your record is available. 2 persons that would come into the clerk or the local government's office where it's held and available at times, available. And then on the second notice on the EA, that's on the structure of how that process took place. So timing is very important, and to provide the correct number of dates is very important. So let's move forward. Okay, common reasons for saying no. In other words, so if you incur costs before the certification is approved, then we'll deny costs. So you want to make sure that you don't enter into contractual agreements, if you incur any costs that are project related before you have that release of funds with the environmental clearance. Floodplain review, if you need to do that, that's a problem. Publications, finding of no significant impact, that needs to be published prior to the consultation. Inadequate public comment periods, not the correct number of days. If it's not sent to the appropriate agencies for comment, in some cases you would send those. It depends upon what's listed in your statutory checklist. Documentation doesn't cut it. It doesn't actually identify how you've come up with the results. And you didn't respond to comments from those authorities in terms of the statutory checklist, for one. Tier 2, we haven't talked a lot about Tier 2 yet, but Tier 2 is a process where it's non-site specific, and you would be moving through and you would be reviewing a number of factors that are determined in the statutory checklist. Keep going. So there are a number of procedural problems that can occur. So if the DLR is wrong, there's an issue. And you may have to start over. If the certification was sent prior to the first comment period expiring to us, that's a problem. You need to go to the manual and look at those items that lay out how you put together the publication notices, whether it's dealing with the CST or whether it's dealing with the EA where you have a combined notice. And then you also submit to the department the timing wise honor about the date of the expiration of the public notice 15-day comment period at the local level and to the department. And then our comment period at the department starts counting at the receipt of that request. So that's very important. And of course, it's filled out correctly. Environmental review, other reasons for not having that review accepted. So you want to make sure mitigation is correct. That's a real important issue in the environmental review record. Next. Oh, okay, that moves in a different format. So the statutory checklist inadequate. So you want to make sure that that statutory checklist is complete. If you've not prepared a statutory checklist, if you've not worked on an ER, an environmental review record, and you've gone through this training, you went to the HUD website, the exchange, you followed through and you passed the WISER, and then all the webinars are over, you had the evaluation, you passed it, and you say, whoa, I got to work on this one. I'm not sure, but I'll just do it. Well, if you're not sure, get a hold of me or Aaron or whoever your program rep is so that we can help you through the process. Go back to the manual and follow the steps. Make sure you understand what needs to be done next. So there is a request for release of funds certification form, and that needs to be completed when you do a category excluded subject to or EA. And that form, you need to make sure that the signature date follows the publication period. So there is a timing worksheet, and you want to make sure that that is dated after all the publication periods have expired. In other words, they're done, and it's not on the same day, it's on the day that follows. Next. And that needs to be submitted. So there's some guidance under 24 CFR 58.43, and in terms of the publication, there is a sample. Send the FONSI to these individuals. If you know of interested parties, local news, you need to publish it. You may want to follow up to those tribal, local, regional offices if necessary. Of course, you'll be identifying, sending that to the state. And then you'll want to make sure that you publish the notice, and we'll need an affidavit of publication. If it's not published, but you do post it, we ask that you post that in 3 places at least. places that are open and customarily viewed or entered by the public, so that it's a public place, post office, if you still have one in your community that's open, the local city hall. Now, if the local city hall or village is only open 2 days a week, that can present a problem. There may be a center that's available that provides those services. That's persons pass through many occasions. You'll need to document the publication also, and you'll need to document the fact that the publication was posted. So that's very important. Move on. So there's different comment period timelines. There's a 7-day for the CEST for public comment. The EA is 15 days public comment. And those, there are no publications for CNST and exempt, or those CEST projects that convert to exempt, because on the statutory checklist, everything was checked off that didn't need to have any follow-up. Go ahead, next. There is a 15-day objection period, so that period starts from the point that receives the original signed request for release of funds and certification form, affidavit of publication, copy of the publication notice is in our hand. It's no sooner than after the publication period has ended. The count can begin if you send an email, but we need that, and it includes those attachments, but we do need that item submitted to us shortly after that email. Do you have any comments on that, Rebecca? I don't know if that goes into Amplifund or not also.
Sorry, I stepped out of the room. You're talking about the ROF certification form?
Right.
Yes, that needs to be uploaded in Amplifund, and then the subrecipient also needs to email us. And I would just attach the form and the email to us, and then let us know that you're sending the original to the department, so we can keep an eye out for that.
Right, because as Rebecca says, you can upload it in Amplifund, but for us to know when that period starts, the contact way is to actually send it as an attachment, and then Rebecca, we need the original.
And we'll start our count day when you guys email it to us.
Right. Now, if you wait 30 days to send the original in, there's going to be an issue. So if you don't send it in, and it's going to be hard for us to take into consideration how we counted based upon the email submission. So.
And the reason why we don't use the date associated with an Amplifund is it's not showing us when you guys truly uploaded that one document in the system. So that's why we are requesting the email to us.
Good point. You'll still need to do uploads for a number of documents, but there are those that to expedite the case, if you resend those to us, it's much easier on our standpoint to make sure that that happens. And go through into the manual for the chapter 6 and look at the timing worksheets for all of these items so that you can actually use that as a working flow chart to allow you to understand the timeline and when events need to take place, begin and start something else and start. Anyway, let's go on.
Hey, Steve, we did receive a question. Did you?
Oh, good.
Cover that? With the posting, if the city hall is not open during full-time normal business hours, do we need to find an alternative place?
Well, what we are asking is similar to what we would do, posting in 3 places. You should post it in more than one place anyway. if the city hall is not open, but you know you have visitors that go to the city hall and find out it's not open, if you have a means to post it in a protected form enclosure on the city hall outside, it's normally where you'd post all your notices and publications. But I would suggest that you find other places to post, if at all possible. If you have a post office, if you have a store, grocery store, or other common or facility that's visited frequently by the community, not by the same individuals all the time, but you may want to consider if they have a place where they post items. It's difficult if you have an office where you only post it there and that facility is only open 2 days a week from 3 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That's not available to the public. Do you have any ideas on that, Aaron or Rebecca?
I don't have
Uh,
anything further.
Okay, hearing none, we'll move along. And then you can always talk to your local officials and find out what do they do. How do they handle the posting of, for example, their board meetings, their public hearings? Where do they post those? If it's only in the village hall, is that significant in terms of the open meeting law? Or does that cover them? If for some reason that facility isn't even open all week because of something that happens. Anyway, clearance, let's talk about clearance, environmental review record, responsible entity signs and is made available to the public. That copy is provided to us. The original, as we mentioned, request release of funds and certification form. And then there is a 15-day objection period for the environmental review record in the earliest day that can be submitted. We'll provide a notice of clearance. As we mentioned very early in this morning, the RE, the responsible entity, signs off on that environmental clearance, signs off and they're held responsible. Make sure that you fill that form out correctly. And I don't know, do we have that sample form anywhere on this training? I can't remember. But
I
anyway,
can show it at the end.
okay, because there are two small boxes that need to be checked, one or the other. And it's very important that you check the correct box. So it's the one that has no adverse impact. We've had some that have read that incorrectly and checked the wrong box of the two. Let's go on. Tiering. So it's Tiering and not Tearing, or tearing. It's defined in the CFR. It's used for CEST projects or EA, but you'll find those mostly in the CEST. Those are projects, as I mentioned earlier, that the address is unknown. So owner occupied rehab, ahead of time you aren't aware of, in most cases, the properties that you'll assist. And even if you have an idea, those may change over time, depending upon how your review goes for income eligibility, review of the property for rehab, bringing that up to safe and sanitary conditions, and the cost of doing so, and the willingness of the property owner to actually have a lien against their property for those improvements. Then it's also in commercial rehab. Let's go on. So we talked about what we would call, for lack of another term, tier one. That's when we know the project site, and tier two, we'll move into that now where we don't know the project site. So you probably do have a designated area that you're working with. It could be the entire community, you've identified that, or it could be a specific part of a community, depending upon the scale of the community in terms of number of units, number of persons that live in, say, for example, Kearney versus Orchard, Nebraska. So it may be the entire, or it may be a designated area where you want to work in for those improvements. If it's housing, you may have already looked at and taken some consideration when you submitted that application on what the intent is for those residents to participate in a program. Next. So you would have a tier 2 on commercial development. Maybe you don't know along the review as far as a downtown revitalization opportunity, which properties are going to be addressed. So you'd end up with doing a tier 2 review, which takes those items in the statutory checklist that need to be followed further in the tier 2 review. Next. Next, this is just an illustration. So we're now into this process for CEST or EA projects. Let's go on. Timing. For the public notice, we've talked considerably about this already. The level of review dictates what timeline you take. The certifying official is the RE who signs the record, and the notices depend upon what's required to be published or posted documentation-wise. Next. Timing steps. Publish or posts, RE signs, affidavits, copies, 15-day, and then an environmental clearance is obtained. Next. And there are CEST timing steps. Publishing, posting, RE signs, and there's certifications and affidavit. There's a 15-day objection period and environmental clearance. Next, okay. So the timing requirements for CEST projects as we move forward. The next slide. So you want to make sure you draft the notice of intent for release of funds. The dates are correct. The timing worksheet, I would review that. Newspaper posting or newspaper notice or posting. Provide notice directly. Next. And then we have some other as we move through. There's the on or about statement. So I'd make sure that you read the sample that we have that you can use to fill out. All comments received. Next.
And we have 2 examples on our CDBG webpage, depending on the type of project you are doing. So if you have a site-specific one, we have draft language for that template. Or if you have one where you will need to be conducting a tier 2, there's a different language to use for that notice. So go ahead, Steve.
And there's some samples of drafting in terms of making sure that you have the correct dates and publications. Go ahead. Remember. See, it says you must verify, complete, and sign. So make sure documents are signed before they're actually posted, that they're available in terms of those comment periods are completed. Next. Okay, here's what you do. We've talked about the original coming into DD before the final objection comment period. Make sure it's all signed. You have an affidavit of publication, copy of publication notice. Next. And then DD must receive all items before the HUD 15-day comment objection period begins. It says HUD, but that's in terms of the state with regards to that for this. Next. Those are samples of forms. Projects that convert to exempt. Real quick, if it's not stated, I want to make sure you understand one of the items that can cause delays, which we've come across, is when that local government or the preparer has gone back to the publisher for an affidavit of publication and they didn't publish it. So you want to make sure and check that whomever, in terms of that publisher, that they published that notice. Because if it's not published, because there's no affidavit to document that it's published, then you're starting over in a new period, and it's increasing your timeline. As we've talked, converting to exempt, there's CST that requires 7 days, 10 days. There's a statutory checklist. CST identifies all items as an A, and no further compliance or consultation is needed. The project converts to exempt. So in the middle of your statutory check, there's 2 items listed. There's an A and a B. The Bs are the ones that need further consultation and follow up, and those are usually checked, especially on the tier 2 side. Now, if you go into an assessment because you need to do an assessment, they're covered in the mitigation part of the assessment. But if they're checked and you're doing, for example, a CEST, and then you need to do a tier 2, you need to make sure that your tier 2 includes all of the B items that you've identified. And please make sure that that is relevant, because we found in some cases that they've checked it as a B, but it didn't need any mitigation. Or they checked it as an A and it needed to be a B where there's mitigation. So if you run all A's, the project converts to exempt. But if it's an EA, it doesn't convert. This has to be a CEST. There's a finding of exempt activity form that you need to complete. And of course, these do not require publications. Next. CST is the only ones that can do that. You can't convert if there's tier 2 reviews. Sometimes that falls into, for example, public works projects where it was determined that an EA wasn't needed. It could be a CEST. They don't require publication. Just said next. So here's your timing steps in words. Publish the combined notice, sign the certificate no earlier than after the combined notice, and submit the affidavit and copy. Then they'll be based upon on or about the date and the date we receive. There's a 15-day objection period by the publication at the state level. Once that objection period is expired and the day following is everything is good, good meaning held to and no compliance issues or objections. As I mentioned, the 15-day comment period at the state level is on the process and procedure, not on the actual environmental review record. That's at the local level. And then an environmental clearance will be issued as long as all the other special conditions are met, because we don't release funds until 1, clearance on environmental, and 2, all the other special conditions are met. We prefer no conditional releases. Next. These are just some helpful hints on publications and signing, and publications a day after the RE signs and so forth. Next. So we do have sample language for the combined notice, and you can find that in our manual or on our website. Let's go through those. Okay, there's a combined notice, a sample of request for release of funds. Next. So here's another iteration of the process on the EA projects. Certification signed, submission of those signed forms, affidavit, publication copy in the comment period, and the clearance. Next. And then some of those publications as such as samples next. Okay, here's the timing sheet for the 8-step process. I'm not going to walk through this based upon the amount of time accounted for this webinar, but I encourage you to use this. And as you move through this, if you follow the timing sheets, you'll notice that forms cannot all be completed on the same day. So feasibly, no. The only time you may have that is when you have an exempt activity and the ER is exempt. But moving forward, you need to be cautionary of how you time out in terms of dates. The 8-step is for those that are floodplains and wetlands. Opportunities to use a 5-step may happen when you do that checklist next. As we talked, you need to know if that's in a floodplain or a wetlands, and there are those resources in terms of FEMA and firm maps, and then there's a wetland resource next. You want to determine if it's in the 100-year floodplain, and there's a firm map that highlights that. So, and that'll go in your ER statutory checklist record and to show the attachment, and that's where you want to make sure you identify the site specific next. And in terms of floodplain management, a good way to identify the sites. And you may want to make sure maybe on project 1 there's an actual address if it's difficult to distinguish next. And wetlands, there's wetland maps and responses, and you can identify those next. And then here's a checklist for the 8-step process, which I've referred to several times. And it is a process whereby you can check out. In other words, not have to do the 8-step, depending upon how you go through the 8-step and what applies next. Okay, you want to determine if it's in the 100-year floodplain. Is there a decision-making process with public notices, alternatives, indirect and direct impacts associated with that? Remember, it's floodplain and wetland next. Identify mitigation, reevaluate alternatives, reevaluate if you need to, if there's no practical alternatives. Make sure it's a public decision and implement the project. Next. Okay,
So if you are the, sorry, Steve. So if you are the certified administrator and you're hired to complete the environmental review record, determining if the project location is in a floodplain should be your first thing to do, because there is several steps, as you can tell from Steve, that need to be completed. So first thing you need to do when completing the environmental review record, determine if it's in a floodplain or a wetland area. Thanks, Steve.
Thanks for the breather. Appreciate it. If you notice on the sidebar there, this is extremely important. The timeline of when you do that 8-step process. Process and completed prior to signing the statutory checklist or EA. So as Rebecca said, in your checklist statutory, one of the first items you'll look at, maybe after you do the real easy ones that don't take long at all, an hour or two, you want to go to FEMA and get a firm map and make a determination. And depending upon the 8-step process, whether you need to do that or not, because we have had cases where the environmental review record, the 8-step process was not done at all, and it was in a floodplain. And then we've also had those where the timing was incorrect. So this is not an after the fact exercise. It's prior to the statutory checklist being completed, which is part of the EA or part of before the EA is signed off, which includes a statutory checklist. So if you're unclear about that, get a hold of us. We've got to explain some of that more next. Source documents, documentation next. And site photos are very helpful. And just for your knowing, we do only have 150 more slides to go through. So looking at site photos, this is especially important in terms of SHPO, in terms of identifying the site when you submit that. So that's helpful. Next. And to identify, don't always look at the front. You may want to look at the back. I'm not sure this is one of our projects. Hope not. Anyway, next. And then, of course, you have those views that are aerial views of the property, whether you go to Google Earth and site reviews, aerial maps next. And then letters are sent to agencies, and then you do have responses to whom it may concern, which hopefully is them next. And the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is one that you always want to contact, depending upon where the project is located. Next. Just keep going. Okay, it's environmental site assessment. This is an ESA, so whether it's a phase 1 or phase 2, you may need to do one, and sometimes they're supported, especially deviating small, but especially on the home side. So let's keep going. So if you do have an ESA on a project, it can be helpful to read that ESA to find out if there are any potential hazards, whether it's radon or maybe it's brownfields in terms of contamination of toxic substances at one time by a facility that was located there. Usually the phase 1 is an observation review of that and what's known about the property. And a phase 2 can actually go into testing of that property beyond the phase 1 if it needs to. And a number of financial institutions would be looking at those next. Minimum steps, site inspection, EPA, historical, there's Sanborn fire insurance maps. So next. This is what a Sanborn fire insurance map looks like. And as you can tell, based on the property, and then if they're available, those are fairly aged back to when they produced those, but that can provide you some actual historical records besides what property owners may know of how that property was used prior. Next. Then there's EPA for documentation on different types of facilities. Next. And then there's some other documentation on air contamination that may be helpful. Next. This is the best one right here. Are we done? Oh.
Hey, Steve, Rebecca here.
Oh, is that it?
That's it. So
Oh, I'm sorry. I finished earlier. We have a minute to go.
So we've received several questions and we only have a minute left. So if we did not answer your question, we'll go ahead and email Amber Ward and we'll answer you guys directly via email. And then on next Tuesday's webinar, we'll go over a couple of the handouts that we didn't touch base on since we took a little bit longer than we thought we would. So please let us know if there's something that's not making sense. Feel free to give Steve, me, Amber, phone call. We can walk you through things. Otherwise, we'll try to answer all your questions we didn't get to on either via email or by on next Tuesday's webinar. So thank you for joining us for this week's webinars. We'll post the materials for next week's webinar on Friday by 2 p.m. Amber will send out another email to everyone. Just for everyone's reference, the state of Nebraska does have next Monday off as a holiday. So if you are trying to reach us, we will not be looking at our email or answering our phones. We'll get back to you later in that week. Anything else that I'm missing, Steve?
Lunch.
Oh, if you, yes, lunch. Also, if you're taking the exam, we are planning on using a electronic resource called Class Marker, and we're testing that out this week, but we do plan to make that test available to you guys on Wednesday after all the webinars are finished, and then you would have to have that exam completed to us by Friday, end of business day. But we'll provide you additional information on that next week. Cool. Well, thank you all for attending. Hopefully everything kind of connects and you have somewhat of an understanding of environmental review record. It's a very in-depth topic, so it is not something you just learn at one time. You constantly have to expose yourself to different resources and learning and other avenues, and we'll send out an email kind of identifying these resources in addition to this. Probably will come out Friday afternoon-ish after that 2 p.m. marker. But thank you again for joining us, and let us know if you have questions. Have a great day.